Welcome to episode 47 with Stanford PhD candidate Marshall Kuypers, where we discuss practical and innovative ways for you to improve decision-making of your CEO and board with cybersecurity investments. Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Hello, I'm your host, Bill Murphy of the Red Zone podcast. If you're new to this show, I invite IT security innovators, leading entrepreneurial minds, and inspiring individuals to share their stories and offer the best tips to help you achieve success in IT security, exponential IT and business thought leadership, neuroscience, creativity, innovation, and more. I'm excited to bring to you my interview with Marshall Kuypers. Marshall is a PhD candidate in management science and engineering at Stanford University, concentrating in risk analysis. His research studies quantitative models to assess cybersecurity risk in organizations. I heard Marshall talk at a major IT security conference, and after listening to him, I knew that I had to get him on the show to share his expertise. Marshall continues a theme that I've been harping on recently, which is for you to deepen your sophistication of communicating at the highest level in your organization about cybersecurity risk, investments that you want your company to mitigate against. For some of you, this is a discussion which will be a reinforcement of concepts and ideas that you already know, but just need to be reminded of. For others, Marshall will bring a fresh approach to you to test with your CFO, CEO, and or board. The more effective you can be with communicating to your horizontal peers and upstream reports, the better you can fulfill your mission within your company. Some major takeaways from this episode are, I think, 6 major areas. Number 1 is a practical and actionable discussion regarding risk analysis for cybersecurity. Also, how to develop situational awareness for making better IT security investment decisions. And then how to look at your internal security event data in a different way, not just log data, to support your IT security investments. And how to validate or eliminate intuition from assessing probability of IT security events happening. This is a fun area that I think you'll enjoy. Also, how to eliminate recency bias from IT security decisions. Basically, how to take away fear and uncertainty cranked up by the media that is really impacting people that are upstream from you, whether that be the CEO or the board. And we also discuss power laws and complex systems theory, which is fun as well. I've linked up all the show notes on the redzonetech.net/podcast, where you can get access to Marshall's presentations and research. This episode is sponsored by the CIO Scoreboard. If you're interested in transforming your ability to distill complex IT security, governance, and audit information into transparent, simple, and visually powerful information that you can show to your vertical reports, like the CFO, CEO, or board, or just your horizontal business peers, check out visualcio.com. Again, that is visualcio.com to learn more. Thank you for listening. Now on with the show. And I want to welcome you to my discussion with Marshall Kuypers. I'm very interested in risk and in educating and spending time talking with senior decision makers and helping them understand some of the leaders, the thought leaders in risk analysis. And so I thought we could spend some time going through your research and some of your findings, in particular related to practical quantitative risk analysis in cyber systems. How did you get interested in this topic, and overall, what was the genesis of it?
So my background's actually not really in cybersecurity. I'm fairly new to the field, and I sort of got my start in risk analysis more generally. And so I'm currently working on my PhD at Stanford University, and the other folks in my research group study quantitative risk in a number of other fields. So for example, we have somebody who's studying the risk of satellite failures. We have somebody looking at the risk of the failure of the power grid, failure in medical devices. And the application that I got interested in happened to be cybersecurity. And one of the things that we noticed when we talked to a lot of decision makers was that while many other types of business risks are fairly well understood, so for example, workman's compensation or how often a building catches on fire or something like that, cyber risk is really not very well understood. And so often you'll have decision makers trying to quantify cyber risk using very qualitative scales. So they'll talk about things being green, yellow, or red. And these qualitative assessments are informing really big decisions of millions of dollars at a lot of organizations. And so what we wanted to do is sort of try to bring an increased level of rigor to that so that we could help organizations ask questions about how effective those different security safeguard investments were and where they should be putting their money.
Yeah, I think that that's a great start. So would you say that there's significant uncertainty around cybersecurity investments right now?
Absolutely. So, from a high level, it's really difficult to know if you're an organization where you should be putting your money. So if I tell you I'm going to give you $1 million to improve your security budget, that might go into better encryption technologies or a better firewall or maybe even employee training to teach your employees how to not click on phishing links. But right now, it's really difficult to know where that money should go or the corresponding risk reduction associated with any of those investments. And this problem is really exacerbated by the fact that there's just a ton of security vendors that are out there that will sell you pretty much anything under the sun. And there's a lot of snake oil and a lot of security products that just don't really deliver. And so, again, what we're trying to do is figure out a way to quantify those cybersecurity investments more effectively so that we can help organizations secure their environment.
So let's talk about this. So when you were doing your research, did you actually physically have to go interview companies and like how many companies would you have to have examined, or did you just look at raw data that was public? How did this morph and evolve as a project from the beginning?
So that's a great question. So this turns out to be a really difficult thing to actually get data that you can do high quality research on in cyber systems. And in my opinion, this is one of the reasons that we haven't seen more progress in cybersecurity research over the last 15 years. So cybersecurity data is just tremendously difficult to get. And when I say cybersecurity data, I'm specifically referring to data on cybersecurity incidents. So I'm really interested in talking to an organization and knowing how many times laptops have gotten stolen in the last year, or how many websites have been defaced, or how many malware infections have you had on users' endpoints. And most organizations actually track this sort of information in internal auditing systems, maybe even an Excel spreadsheet, but most organizations usually have a fair degree of visibility into that. I'm not really interested in log data. I'm interested typically in these cybersecurity incidents where an investigator will go and open up one of these incidents. They'll sort of resolve and investigate it, and then they'll close these incidents. So even though organizations have these data, it's really, really difficult for researchers to get. And so basically we try to use every trick in the book where we would talk to different organizations and develop a good relationship with them where we could say, look, we'd really like to take a look at these data because we think that there are really meaningful insights in them that we could discover. And what we found was that when we talked to the vast majority of organizations, so even huge tech firms in the Bay Area, a lot of these organizations reported these data of how often they see different types of cyber attacks, but there were very few companies that were actually doing any sort of analysis on these data. And so what we could do is go in and we could say, look, if you give us access to these data in a very short period of time, like we're talking about like a day in Excel, you can find some really meaningful insights that dramatically improve your situational awareness. And once we've been able to demonstrate this with a couple companies, there have been a steady stream of other organizations that have expressed interest in collaborating with us.
Yeah, because you're speaking at some significant events. So I found it interesting that a young researcher like yourself has actually kind of gone right to the top of the heap, so to speak, from a visibility point of view. So you must be on to something important, because what's interesting is that as I have these conversations on risk with Jack Jones and others, the probability and likelihood data of events happening seems to be the missing element, but it's one of the more challenging ones to gather information on. So you're saying that you can actually gather this organizational data but you're actually kind of going direct to companies that are storing this information for really auditing purposes, but they're not necessarily making the information public.
Exactly. So there are very few incentives for organizations to disclose a lot of these data. So for example, like media attention could very easily drag one of these companies' names through the mud and unfairly make them look like they're doing a poor job at cybersecurity. And some of these are even definitional problems. They're probably well known to many of your listeners, where if you say that an organization has experienced 1 million cyber attacks in the last month, the public may see that as extremely alarming, whereas any security professional will say, well, if you're talking about millions of attacks, then you're probably defining a port scan as an attack, which is not very interesting. And so it is very, very difficult to get these data. And so historically, researchers have had to rely on publicly reported databases. And so there are a couple, pretty high quality ones that are out there. So for example, the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse is a great resource, or the Veris community has a great database that people can go and look at a bunch of cybersecurity breaches that have been recorded over, a 6 to 10 year period of time. But those are still even a very biased view of the sorts of incidents that an organization might be experiencing. And there are really only 1 or 2, if any, research papers that look at all cyber security incidents at a single organization. And so inherently, if you rely on those publicly available databases, you're going to only be looking at those really large impact incidents, and you're not really getting a view of those smaller impact incidents. And what we found when we actually go into an organization and we see everything from start to finish, the low-level attacks, but then also those very severe attacks, we find that the organization actually has some patterns in how it experiences attacks that are tremendously useful from a risk modeling perspective. So number one, it turns out that a lot of the rate or the frequency of these cybersecurity incidents is remarkably consistent over time. So a lot of us will read reports like from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report or other industry reports that basically indicate that the number of attacks is going up dramatically and the number of cyber breaches is also skyrocketing. And there's actually virtually no evidence that that's actually true. So even in the publicly available databases, there have been several academic papers that have been published that show that the rate of attacks is remarkably consistent over time. And then similarly, they've looked at the severity distribution. How bad are these attacks? Are they getting worse? And again, I think that if you talk to most lay people, they say absolutely, cyber is increasing in severity, things are getting much worse, we're headed towards a really dark period. But again, there's virtually no statistical evidence to support that. All of the numbers that we actually have when we actually look at them show that the severity distribution of a lot of these cyber attacks is also remarkably consistent over time. And so what we've basically shown is that by, again, looking at all incidents at a single organization, you can start to draw out these really interesting, sometimes counterintuitive insights that can really aid a decision maker in how they're doing resource planning.
Okay, so this is really fascinating. So counterintuitive, well, let's start out there. Let's start with counterintuitive insight. So we have one way of gathering the data, which is kind of looking at the Verizon breach report. You can look at some of the clearinghouse information and such. And so that's kind of common knowledge. If someone's willing to do the research, they can dive in there and make some assumptions and probability and events and things of that nature happening over time to fill in their probability and likelihood gaps. So if we have to get into some of the counterintuitive things that you're finding, so we know the data exists and the models exist and the risk is quantifiable, and we know that there's some of the assumptions you're finding are false or misleading or don't exist, but you're finding some different evidence. I'd love to hear more about that would seem counterintuitive to a normal way of doing it.
Sure. So I think that absolutely the first major insight that we've been able to determine is the fact, again, that the rate and the severity of many of these cybersecurity incidents is not changing nearly as rapidly as most people think. So again, we find some weak evidence, for example, that malware attacks are going down at certain organizations and that some attackers may be pivoting to using certain attack vectors like ransomware or malicious email more frequently. But what's really interesting is that for a large organization, if you were to look at the data, what you'd probably find is that this change is occurring incredibly slowly, like on the time scale of years. So the cyber domain is evolving, but again, not nearly as quickly as a lot of other folks think. And this is a really important consideration because I think one of the reasons that the field of cybersecurity professionals may not be as interested in using historical data is because they think that everything is changing so quickly that it's really, really difficult to get any insights from something that happened 2 or 3 years ago. And while cybersecurity is undoubtedly a attacker-defender problem where there are dynamics and evolution that are occurring, again, it's very interesting and surprising that this is actually occurring on a fairly slow timescale. And so what happened last year at your organization is actually a fairly good indication of what might happen in the next year.
So malware, for example, is what you're saying is that the media is talking about malware and its different variants, from shell-shock to cryptolocker to all these different exotic forms of malware. And what you're saying is that although we might classify these as exotic and increasing, the actual rate of these incidents is remarkably steady.
Exactly. So it would be really interesting, too, to hear from many of your listeners that this fits their intuition, because while there has been a lot of media coverage of some of these more interesting cyber attacks in the last couple of years, my sort of intuition is that these have been happening for the last 10 or 15 years, and that most security professionals would say, yes, we've been dealing with attackers at a steady rate for a long period of time. It's just that the media wasn't that interested in them until a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that the interesting piece here is that when you're developing the likelihood and probability of events happening, it's very easy to be swayed by the kind of public opinion versus evidence. And I think the amount of time and effort that goes into gathering evidence is potentially daunting for folks. So if you're a layperson, CIO or CISO, that sort of wants to get to the bottom of this quickly, how would you recommend that they do this?
So this is a great question. This is something that I would love to talk about. So, to take a step back, my research is really focused on normative decision-making, or in other words, how should people make decisions about investing in cybersecurity? And before we figure out how people should be making decisions, one of the first steps is to figure out how people currently are making decisions, or the behavioral side of things. And there's a really rich, interesting field of behavioral decision-making that I think is almost one of the fundamental pieces of background knowledge that security professionals should have. So, for example, there's a ton of really great research that shows that people are really, really bad at making decisions and assessing probabilities and doing all sorts of other things. So, for example, there's evidence that shows that the order in which you ask a question can change the answer that somebody might give you, or the way that you phrase a question. So, for example, people have gone out to doctors and they say, how many of you would recommend surgery in the case where the 1-month survival rate is 90%? And then in the second case, they go to another group of doctors and they say, how many people would recommend surgery if there's a 10% mortality in the first month? And you can see that 90% survival rate and 10% mortality, that's the same thing. It's just phrased differently. But in the first case, where you're highlighting the fact that 90% of people survive, 84% of doctors recommend surgery. While in the second case, when you highlight the mortality, only 50% of doctors do.
Yeah, that's
and so
stunning.
This is kind of right. It's terrifying to a certain degree, because if I'm going in for a major surgery, I don't want the way that I phrased the question to impact the recommendation that my doctor is going to give me. However, again, there's just a huge body of scientific evidence at this point that shows that the way that we phrase questions absolutely changes how we think about some of these answers. And so there are a bunch of other interesting names for these types of biases as well. So, for example, there's the recency bias. So, for example, if I'm biking around campus and I have somebody who comes screaming in, there's an undergraduate and they almost run into me, they're not wearing a helmet, they almost caused me to crash, that's really fresh in my mind. And so for the next week after that, I'm going to be a really defensive bike rider because that event happened very recently. However, as time goes on, maybe a month later, I've forgotten about that. And so maybe then I start riding my bike much faster than I should. And this is something, again, that we really, really see in cybersecurity. And so after the Snowden leaks, there were a ton of chief information security officers that were really, really interested in trying to find their malicious insiders, even though in many organizations, there's virtually no evidence that malicious insiders are actually a major threat to that organization. And so we have to be really aware of these biases that we have inherently in order for us to make better decisions moving forward. And so if your listeners have some free time, I think one of the best resources for this is a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and it's a fantastic, really interesting book. It's very accessible, and it goes through basically all these biases that humans have. And once you start to learn about those and understand them, it really arms you so that you maybe can't necessarily correct for them, but you know when you might be making a biased decision.
I think this is a stunning point you're making and important. By the way, I've read that book as well. It's really wonderful for people to get. I agree with that with you. And it's so much based on fear and uncertainty and doubt, the profession, and it's really easy to just get the fear part of the brain really going and really forget some of the logical empirical data and evidence because we're completely acting from fear, which is clouding our intuition and our decision making. You also made the point of parole decision. Maybe you can explain the parole decision making for Israeli prisons.
Sure. So there's a really interesting paper that basically looks at the proportion of favorable decisions for people who go in front of a parole board if they're in an Israeli prison. And it shows how many, basically what their likelihood is of getting parole throughout the day. And what you notice is that it starts pretty high, and then there's a steady decrease throughout the day of the chances of you making parole. And then there are two huge jumps. And we can look at that. We can be like, well, that's really strange. What could be causing that? And what the authors of that paper found was that those two jumps where all of a sudden, basically like if you're 15th in line, you have only a 10% chance of making parole, but if you're 16th in line, then you have an 80% chance of making parole. Those jumps actually corresponded to lunch breaks. So again, really terrifying that the judges who are making incredibly important decisions, who are supposed to be impartial and they have great judgment, are really being influenced by their blood sugar levels. So if you happen to find yourself in an Israeli prison, make sure that you go in front of the board right after everybody has taken their lunch break, right? That's your big takeaway from today. But your point earlier, that we have all these biases and we really need data to inform these decisions. I think that's absolutely correct. So with one chief information security officer that we worked with, we asked them, where do you think your major risk is for next year? Where should your security budget be going? And they said, absolutely malicious insiders. That's what I'm really worried about. That's where I think all my risk is. And we looked historically at this organization. They're a very large organization. And over a 6-year time period, they had exactly one malicious insider incident. And this was somebody that they could have seen coming a mile away. They were a system administrator that had gotten fired. The organization didn't revoke their login credentials. So later that night, once they'd been fired, they logged back in and they messed a bunch of stuff up. And during that same 6-year time period, they had over 200 website compromises. And these ranged from website defacements, SQL injections that got huge amounts of data, and then also included nation states that were actively compromising and exfiltrating large amounts of intellectual property from this organization. And so when we showed this to the chief information security officer, it was really an aha moment where they said, wow, my intuition really does not correspond to the reality that the data are showing us of where the actual risk is in our organization. And so, again, once we know that, this really demonstrates the importance of needing to go out and base our decisions in actual hard evidence and data, because if we use these qualitative methods or hand-waving methods, there are just so many ways that our intuition can fail us that we end up making really bad security investment decisions.
Did you use the word hand-waving? Hand-waving?
Correct, yeah.
So basically meaning that someone's waving their hands because this is such an important event and they're waving their hands?
So I would almost say waving your hands is, and you're making it up, right? You're talking in a very overt way. So you're saying, oh, trust me, I've thought about this, and this is really what we need to do. Lots of times you'll see, security vendors doing this where they'll say, buy my product, it'll solve all your problems. I really understand what's your core business need. And, we want to be able to test that. We want to be able to say, well, how many of the attacks that we see actually come in through our email, and what's a low, medium, high estimate of how effective this new email filter might be. And then let's take a look at the different impact measures for these different cybersecurity incidents, and let's see which are most costly, and let's base our decisions off of those instead of just what somebody is telling us.
So let's get super practical. One of the things you had talked about was the data exists, and you were saying you weren't necessarily looking at log data, which is interesting. You were looking at some other, obviously other pieces of data. What are those types of information that if someone's listening, they can immediately go talk to their teams and start siphoning the data points?
Sure. So again, I'll make the distinction between log data and security incident data. And log data, I think, can be useful in some context, especially if you're trying to piece together exactly what happened in a certain cybersecurity incident. But the issue with them is that there is a tremendous amount of noise in those signals, and you're dealing with a huge amount of data, and it's really often difficult to know what's going on. And further, to really find any actionable information from those log data. And really, at the end of the day, what we're most interested in finding are data that we can make actionable decisions off of. So what I encourage organizations to do, number one, is if they're not recording cybersecurity incidents, they should start. And so when I say cybersecurity incidents, again, think of high-level incidents. So how many times a laptop gets stolen? Again, every time that you see a website attack or an SQL injection where somebody actually makes off with information, malware infections, maybe somebody sending a phishing email into your organization, any of those real incidents where somebody from the security operations center or the security operations team has to go in and investigate. So lots of times these will involve the attacker actually getting some sort of information. Sometimes it may be just ensuring that the attacker was unsuccessful. So for example, if you have spam emails coming into your organization, then your investigator is going to go in and make sure that nobody clicked on something that they shouldn't, or nobody exposed their credentials, or if they did, they're going to have to reset those credentials. So I would say focus on those high-level incidents, and then start recording those if you're not already. And I think that the things that are most important to record are, number one, this incident categorization. So you can do this in the form of tags. So you can say hashtag email incident or hashtag website attack or something like that. And then the other major thing that's really valuable to record about these incidents would be some sort of quantitative impact measure. And historically, this has been difficult to do. So lots of times if there's even personally identifiable information that's disclosed, maybe you might be able to record the number of records that are exposed, but even that has some uncertainty. And then when we start to get into other loss categories like reputation damage, that's been so difficult to quantify historically that a lot of organizations just say, well, I don't know if it's between 10 million or 30 million, so I'm just going to call it high. But there's actually a huge amount of value in specifying that it's between 10 and 30 million, because we find that a lot of these cybersecurity incidents follow what's called a heavy tail distribution, which basically means that you have incidents that span the severity across orders of magnitude. So the vast majority of incidents at your organization are going to have a severity or a cost of less than $100, but then every so often you're going to have one that costs your organization $10,000, $100,000, even millions of dollars. And when you have that spread across orders of magnitude, that's really the hallmark of what these heavy tail distributions are. And so knowing that you're in a heavy tail distribution is tremendously valuable for a decision maker. We can talk about that in a little bit if you're interested. But basically you need some quantitative metric to record to be able to determine that. And so, again, if you're an organization and you're recording these cybersecurity incidents, encourage your security team to put down perhaps how many hours of investigation they spent investigating and remediating an incident. And we're not really interested in the difference between 7 or 8 hours or 32 or 33 hours. What we're really interested in is the difference between a 5-hour incident and a 500-hour incident. And so generally, folks are pretty comfortable getting the order of magnitude right. And if you get the order of magnitude right and you have some quantitative measure, instead of just saying this was a high, low, or high, medium, or low, or a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 incident, there's so much more that you can do with those data.
And the value of that is just so that you can start to be able to show decision makers the potential impact and what it costs the company. Is that one of the pieces you're trying to get to?
Absolutely. So again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is actually come up with a final number for cyber risk. So we want to tell an organization, this is how much we think you're going to lose next year. And instead of just coming up with a point estimate, we're actually going to give them a probability distribution. So we're going to say, there's a 30% chance that you're going to lose less than $1 million due to a hack. And there's a small, maybe a 1% chance that the year next year is going to be really, really bad. So then you're going to lose, 10 or $20 million. So giving that whole probability distribution is where we can really start to inform a better decision-making process. The CISO can take that information to the board and they can say, look, here's our risk curve that we have currently. And then if we put a new firewall in place or a new intrusion detection system, this is how that actually changes that. So again, we're trying to get towards that quantification. And being able to record the severity of different cybersecurity incidents basically allows us to come up with those inputs that we can put into this risk model. And there are a bunch of really interesting mathematical subtleties for why this is important to do. So going back again to the fact that a lot of these incidents follow a power law distribution, what that often means is that even though you've only had incidents that range between 1 and 1,000 hours of impact, you can, with high confidence, extrapolate into how often incidents of larger severities will occur. So even though you've never had an incident that takes 10,000 hours to investigate and remediate, the fact that this is a power law distribution or a heavy tail distribution often allows a decision maker to be able to say, based on the information that we have, we think that we're going to have one of those major hacks that costs 10,000 hours of incident investigation time. We think that's going to occur once every 10 years or something.
Yeah, and I can see where this really helps. I was looking at some of your examples during our conversation about lost devices. I mean, we can break this down into, it supports the security investment in a major way. If you're going after a $10,000 investment or $100,000 or $1 million investment in some IT security object or service, and you can then back that out to the likelihood of events happening and map it to likelihood and risk. This is raising the level of sophistication more to what finance is used to, what insurance industry is used to. It's sort of raising the bar from the IT security perspective.
Absolutely. And I'll have to say that the cyber insurance folks are some of the most interested people in these new tools because, they understand lots of other types of risk very effectively. So, they have a general intuition for how much they should charge me as a young male for car insurance based on demographics and things like that. However, for cybersecurity, we basically have none of that information. So cyber insurers really have no idea if the size of the organization matters or your website security actually makes a difference or what domain you're in matters either. And so what we want to do is sort of get a general intuition for this to be able to test some of those assumptions and to be able to, again, quantify risk instead of relying on, a low, medium, high severity assessment. And again, I think that one of the main values in risk quantification for the CISO would be how do you actually communicate that risk to the board level? So, currently if you go into a boardroom or you talk with your chief executive officer and you say, look, I want $1 million to put full disk encryption on all of our devices, there are a lot of boards that will say, well, how much money is that going to save? And what is the cost effectiveness of that investment? And right now there aren't a lot of tools out there that can help a CISO answer that question. But if we actually do risk quantification techniques, we can say, oh, well, it turns out that it's going to cost us $1 million to put full disk encryption on all of our devices, and we think that we're going to save on average $4 million per year based off of these assumptions. So this is a really great investment. It's a 4-to-1 benefit cost ratio. And then this helps justification for a CISO's IT security budget, which we think is a really good thing.
Being able to take this down to that summary level with all of the support data underlying it, it takes the emotion out of the decision, and it takes the raw intuition and the raw emotion. I think intuition is always going to be there. You can't make it go away, but we can certainly take the emotion out of it so that we're just dealing with more, I would say, adult-oriented, regular business decision-making.
I agree. So if you look at most other boardrooms, almost all other business risks are assessed on a monetary scale. And it's interesting that even in some of the financial services industries, they would have these risk registries for how risky or what the probable losses are for several different incidents that might impact the organization. And historically, they've used dollars for everything except for cyber, which is really bizarre. They'd have this other scale. Maybe they talk about the confidentiality, availability, integrity of data, but they don't talk about dollars. And what we really care about is, how much are these cybersecurity incidents going to cost us? And again, while this was a really difficult question to answer 10 or 15 years ago, there's actually a surprising amount of high-quality research in the industry reports and data these days that can inform those questions. So we can actually help organizations put a monetary value on a lot of these things, like reputation damage or the loss of intellectual property or other like equipment damage that historically have been very difficult to quantify.
And that includes like PII fines, investigation costs, forensics costs. So all of that, are you saying that, is it in a single source, or is it something that's just a couple websites that people can go to, or where would people go to find that information? You call it data spillage. Is that what you use to refer to the categorization of when you lose data and information, what's the cost? Is that something that as a subscription service or something that's online, publicly available?
Yeah, so I would say that the information sources for this are all over the place. And what I'm trying to do for my dissertation is basically provide a cookbook for how an organization can go through and compile that information and basically present a comprehensive review of what all of those data sources are and why they're valuable. So, some of them you do have to look pretty hard for. So, for example, legal fines due to cybersecurity incidents is sort of a obscure topic. There have been a couple academic papers that have been written about it. So there you really have to know where to look to actually get good probability and impact information on the chances that somebody's going to sue you if you have a data breach. There are other sources of information for other types of data losses that are really, really accessible. So for example, investigation time. If an organization is recording this already, like they have that data in-house. Similarly for the rate of different cybersecurity incidents, so how often a website defacement occurs. This is something that a lot of organizations have in-house. And then there are other vectors too, or other attack impacts. So for example, reputation damage. Here what we're basically trying to help organizations do is quantify reputation damage via a elicitation that's called a willingness to pay, or expert probability elicitation. And so here, reputation damage is highly dependent on what type of organization you are. If you're a retailer, or you're a defense contractor, or you're a public university. And so what we'll do is we'll sort of survey the literature to sort of get an idea of how many of these incidents have occurred before. So for example, we might be able to look at the Target data breach or the RSA hack. And there, those companies are still in business. So intuitively, we know that these cybersecurity incidents or the reputation damage, they're not costing that organization billions of dollars. But then we can also look at some of the numbers that are reported in the media, and it's certainly going to cost that organization more than $50 million if you disclose, on the order of a couple hundred million credit cards or personally identifiable information records. And so what we'll do is we'll actually work with the organization to try to quantify that for their organization. And so the way that this works is that we'd sit down with the decision maker and we'd say, what is the reputation damage that you might experience if you have a really impactful hack? And oftentimes a decision maker will say, well, I have no idea. And we'll say, really? Because, do you think it's more than $10? And they say, well, absolutely. Of course it's more than $10. And then we'd say, well, is it going to cost your organization less than $10 billion? And they say, well, of course it is, And so we say, great, we're well on our way to quantifying what that reputation damage is. And so what we basically do is we try to talk with them to get a range of reputation damages. And basically what we do is incorporate that entire distribution or that uncertainty over those different possible losses into the analysis. So again, we're not looking for just a point estimate. We don't want a decision maker to say, well, if we have a really bad hack, it's going to cost us X. It's totally fine to give us a range. And when we incorporate that range into the models that we're creating, it turns out that that's a really important feature of being able to make well-informed security decisions. You don't want to assume away that uncertainty. You actually want to embrace that uncertainty, and you want to incorporate it into your models.
Yeah, I like your concept of embracing uncertainty because I think that is sort of counterintuitive for the security profession, but I think it makes a ton of sense the way you talk about these large events not being are not outliers. I really like that concept.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, as far as someone that can get started, just to summarize, is basically we can start to look at our internal data, the incident data, the time to resolve the information, and start to tag the types of incidents as we see them. That's a very practical starting point to get started, right?
Absolutely. So, my number one recommendation, again, for organizations is to take a look at the data that you have and then try to run some analysis on it. And you don't need a master's student from a top university to do this. This is something that an undergraduate in statistics should be able to do, and they should be able to do it in Excel. And so at many of these organizations that we've worked with, again, it was surprising to us that these data existed and nobody had ever looked at them. And so we could go into that organization and in literally 3 or 4 clicks in Excel, we could put together a graph that would just blow their mind. So, and we could say, look, it actually looks like the rate of cybersecurity incidents at your organization is pretty steady over time, except for this little blip right here back in 2013. And they say, oh yeah, that of course corresponded to an attack campaign that we experienced. So absolutely encourage your folks to go out and just do some base level statistical analysis on these cybersecurity incidents. And if you're not currently recording those, that is, I think, one of the best things your organization can do to improve its situational awareness. Just start coming up with some sort of categorization, or you can consult some resources like the Veris community again to look at what their cybersecurity incident categorization is, and just start recording data. And then a year down the road, you're going to have this really powerful tool that you can go back to basically look to see what is occurring at your organization.
And what I love about this, the way you bring this together as we come to a closing point here, Marshall, is that, in the VP of sales, when he walks into the CEO and says that this is the sales that we're going to deliver to the organization this year, it's never, these are the exact figures. There's a range. And there's some uncertainty, and there's a lot of discussion about how that uncertainty is going to be addressed, mitigated. There's a high watermark, low watermark. It's got to be about the ranges, and there's certainly bare minimums that the sales of the company needs to deliver on, but it's never, and we've got to get out of IT security of certainty. There is going to be a range, and if we start to communicate it to the board, then we can develop really, we can make it align our investments to address uncertainty from this point of view.
Absolutely, and I'll add there that it's not just that we need to give ranges, right? Like there's a distinction here that giving a color like green, yellow, or red is not the same as giving a range. So a range inherently has some uncertainty with it, but it's a quantitative expression of uncertainty. So you'd never see a salesperson go in and say, well, we think that sales next quarter are going to be yellow or orange, right? That's meaningless. They actually put some uncertainty in that. They put a range in, but that range is quantified to a certain degree. And that's exactly what we need to do for information security as well.
Thanks for making that point. Other than the book that you recommended earlier, Think Fast and Slow, what other books have you come across that you find either really useful from the behavioral point of view that you were making earlier, or cognitive biases, or from the just raw statistics, or from that you've run into?
So I'll say that there aren't a ton out there, in my opinion. I think that security professionals actually need to be really careful about what they're reading and what they're consuming. So, for example, there are a lot of industry reports that are out there that, in my opinion, are worse than useless or even harmful, where you have industries that are using totally bogus definitions of words like malware or virus. And in some cases, you even have industry reports that will go so far as to make up statistical words. So they'll say like things like precision intervals, which don't actually exist. There are confidence intervals, there are credible intervals, but precision intervals do not in fact exist. So you have to be really careful about this in practice. And I don't necessarily have a good list of resources for people to go out to consult. I think that the book Thinking Fast and Slow is absolutely a really, really great resource. There's a similar book written by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink that some readers may be familiar with. It's of the same flavor as Thinking Fast and Slow, but I'm actually going to strongly encourage folks not to read Blink and to read Thinking Fast and Slow instead, for reasons that I won't go into. I think that there are a couple other resources out there as well. So some people may be familiar with the company Risk Lens or the FAIR method or the FAIR Institute. And this is some work that's been put together by some folks that is along the same lines of all the things that I've been advocating for. So risk quantification, uncertainty, data-driven analysis, and it's some really high-quality stuff. So if you are interested in a book that's sort of a cookbook for this type of analysis, your readers can go out and find this book online. And give me 1 second and I'll...
Actually, you're talking about the Jack Jones's book, the Fair Factor Analysis Information Risk book?
Absolutely, yeah. So I would really recommend Measuring and Managing Information Risk, A Fair Approach by Jack Jones. So I think, in my opinion, that, again, is a really great resource for security professionals.
I'm glad you brought that up. He's been on the podcast a couple times, and I agree with you. Great, and that's why you're here too, because I feel like this education is what the profession needs right now to kind of bring the standard that we deliver to the board up to bring that high watermark up even higher. So this is really good. So one of the things I want to talk about just as we go is your interest in the complexity group at Stanford. I found that infinitely interesting, and I know there's not necessarily a direct correlation between what we're talking about in it, but I'd love for you just to give an overview of what the complexity group is at Stanford and some of your personal interest in it. And just if you can give an example for everyone listening of what it is, and I think that would be a good way to wrap up.
So I am the co-president of the Stanford Complexity Group, and we study complex systems. And complex systems, again, this is going to be fairly distinct from my research in cyber systems. But I think it's tremendously interesting and actually a really important concept for people to get, which is why I'm involved in this group at Stanford. And when we say complex systems, we actually mean something pretty precise when we say that. So we're not talking about simply a complicated system. So for example, a locomotive train is very complicated, but I wouldn't call it complex. So when we say complex, what we usually mean is that it's a system that's made up of many different agents that are all interacting, and there's some form of emergent behavior. And so the classic example of a complex system is a flock of birds. So you can take each one of those birds and you can tell it to follow just two simple rules. So for example, stay as close to my neighbor as possible, but don't run into my neighbor. And if you tell all the birds to do that and then you put them together in a big flock, you get these wonderful flocking patterns that are incredibly complicated and they can avoid predators incredibly well. And you'd never be able to predict or understand any of that emergent macro behavior by simply looking at the individual birds. This is really the essence of putting all these different agents together and watching them interact. And so that's what complexity studies. And complex systems are all around us. Economies are complex. There's a lot of really interesting research that's been done on chaos and fractals and cellular automata and a ton of other really interesting topics.
So what I find interesting is that the interdisciplinary approach, so if you're really deep on your domain and then you have someone that's deep on molecular biology and you have another person that studies in another discipline, what I find was interesting when I was reading about this group is that what's the value of having multiple disciplines together? The example that was on the site was that you have the coordinated behavior of ant colonies where no ants are in charge. How could that possibly have to do with the production of thoughts in the brain and how both of these phenomena may relate to ancient notions of spirit and the soul? And I found that interesting that the group, those are three very different areas. So what would your complexity group try to approach with that particular example?
So we're a huge proponent of interdisciplinary teams. And one of the reasons for this is that in complex systems especially, what we see are these phenomena that have universality. And universality basically is that you find the same essence or the same property in many different seemingly unrelated systems. And so earlier in the podcast, we were talking about power laws and this basically mathematical relationship of how often something happens versus its size. And what's really interesting about power laws is that they're in all sorts of different seemingly unrelated systems. So if you look at the number of Twitter followers people have, it turns out that follows a power law distribution. If you look at the income distribution in the United States, same thing, it's power law distribution. You can look at the population of cities. You can look at the lengths of different segments on a tree. So how often a tree branches, that also follows a power law. The lungs in humans and on all mammals also follow a branching pattern that follows a power law distribution. And so again, what we see is that there's this same phenomenon that we see in many, many different unrelated systems. And so what's really useful from the interdisciplinary standpoint is to get a lot of different people together. So perhaps if, in cybersecurity, we're really stuck on a certain problem, maybe we can bring in a biologist who says, you know what, we had a very similar problem when we were thinking about cancer, and this is how we formulated that problem, and this is the solution that we came up with. So then we can take a look to see if any of those solutions might be applicable to the cyber domain.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I had a guest named Michael Michalko, who's a creativity expert. He's written several books, and one of the sections of the book was bringing in disparate domains. When you're trying to solve a problem, don't solve it from the part of your brain that is related to that discipline. Actually say, how would another system solve this problem? And so I just found it interesting that you were going down that path, because that was almost, again, another discipline. A creativity expert was actually talking about this as well. So it's interesting that you and I are having this conversation about potentially solving problems using other disciplines.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, listen, Marshall, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I really want to congratulate you on your work. It's really profoundly informative and practical for the CISO and the CIOs that are from the small, medium, and large businesses in the United States and across the world. So I appreciate you for your depth of insight in research in this area.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I look forward to once you get your dissertation, when you have that published. I'd love to have you on for a round 2.
Sounds good.
And we're going to I'll link up all of your presentations and links to the books you recommended, and also so people can get in touch with you. What's the best way? Through your Stanford website if they want to reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to reach out to me. The best email to reach me at is mkuypers@stanford.edu. Also, you can visit my website. The easiest way to find it is to just Google my name and Stanford. And we have a couple of resources up there, papers that we have published, and a couple other documents that might be useful to some people in the IT field.
Thanks again, Marshall. Have a great rest of the day, and look forward to having you on in the future.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
Okay.
So there you have it. That was Marshall Kuypers. I hope you really enjoyed my conversation with him. You'll find the information and resources we discussed on the show notes page at redzonetech.net/podcasts. Also, make sure to check out our sponsor, CIO Scoreboard. Learn how to integrate your auditing and compliance objectives with real and practical IT security investments by using powerful visualization tools that remove complexity from IT business decision-making. Go to visualcio.com to learn more. Until next time, I'm signing off. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.